Welcome to the Kaiser Report. I'm Max Kaiser. Hey, it's World War III. So the headlines say, certainly in the markets, it's gold up, silver up, gold and oil is really up. Markets are down, currency's down, Gazprom down. What next for the Ukraine? Is this the end of the globalization? Well, we'll be answering the specifics in this next episode of the Kaiser Report. But first, we're going to talk about the greater geoeconomic and financial context of why the world is so frickin' FUBAR. FUBAR. Stacey.
Frickin' FUBAR?
Stacey, FUBAR.
Well, yes, let's look at the context of why there are sort of constant conflicts and war and chaos, especially around oil-rich areas or anything that is important to the energy grid of the global world. Exclusive Citigroup profits hit by major Mexican fraud, as Chief Executive Michael Corbett admits. Impact to our credibility is harder to calculate. So Citigroup was forced to warn on their profits because of a subsidiary in Mexico. Citi's Mexican subsidiary lent $585 million to a local oil industry services company called Oceanografia through its accounts receivable financing program. This is where the bank lends money secured against the value of invoices the client has sent out to customers in awaiting payment about the invoices were faked, and as much as $400 million was stolen from Citi during the course of the fraud. So comparing this to what's happened in the real world recently is transaction malleability. This is what Mt. Gox's Mark Karpelès blamed the Bitcoin collapse on. Here we have a situation very similar where invoices were faked, essentially defrauding Citigroup in Mexico of $400 million.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting comparison with the Mt. Gox situation, because here on the blockchain, they have something that Citigroup does not have. We can look at it closely here. They're involved in a $400 million scam with a Mexican subsidiary, where the Mexican subsidiary is forging credit receivables. And of course, Citibank will process the forged documents, no accountability at all, because they know, in this case, they will simply get a check from the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States to cover up any losses. The Fed will just write them a check. It'll cover the $400 million. Its moral hazard has gone hyperbolic in the banking system. Whereas on the blockchain from Mt. Gox, there is no bailout. There is no central reserve Bitcoin bank to simply bail out corrupt institutions. So they're going to have to go out of business. They're just declared that they're going out of business. And that's the way capitalism works. Bitcoin is maintaining capitalism into the 21st century, where it has died with the likes of Citigroup and JP Morgan and HSBC have killed capitalism. Bitcoin is the only thing left.
Well, a few things. Okay, first of all, the transaction malleability situation, the accusations that Mark Karpelès blamed that has been categorically proven to be false, because we did not need to rely on KPMG or PricewaterhouseCoopers or any other accounting firm. The people looked at the blockchain and found no evidence at all. It would have been seen on the blockchain, and then they could say that, in fact, this so-called fraud did not happen. We're taking Citigroup's word here that this was actually a fraud and that they were not involved in it, or nobody in their local subsidiary was. In fact, the faked invoices made it look like Oceanografia's customer, the state oil company Pemex, had approved the payments, when in fact it had done no such thing. An employee at Citi's Mexican division, Banco Nacional de Mexico, processed them.
Yeah, well, Citibank, whether they're aware of the fraud or not, doesn't make any difference. They have nobody. They don't pay anybody to in the compliance department or in the oversight department, and the regulators are in their pocket. So they just will accept anyone's credit for cash, because if it's not good, they get a bailout. Now, transaction malleability, which is the heart of the Mt. Gox scandal. I mean, you're correct in that there is no such thing as transaction malleability. That's a fraudulent term, like credit default swap is a fraudulent term. Credit, collateralized debt obligations are just, it's just a term made out of nothing, really. It doesn't mean anything. You can't. There's no collateral at all, backing up this Ponzi scheme in the banking system. So for same thing with transaction malleability. It's a made-up term. It means nothing. It has no context in the real world.
Well, it actually does. It does exist, but in the case of Mt. Gox, it does not exist, because human beings could go and look on the blockchain and see that it didn't happen.
Yeah, or I could call it a papaya milkshake. I mean, if I were Mark Capellas and said, we lost 400 million Bitcoin because of a papaya milkshake, it would be the exact same thing as saying transaction malleability. Papaya milkshakes do exist. It has no reference to Bitcoin. Transaction malleability, yeah, it exists, but it has no reference and no context. It has nothing to do with Bitcoin. It has nothing to do with the blockchain. It's just a guy talking out of his butt to cover his butt about a theft one way or another because he's as corrupt as Jamie Dimon. It doesn't mean, Bitcoin doesn't mean that we won't have the Jamie Dimons of Bitcoin. It doesn't mean we won't have the, the Hester, the molester, the banker here in the UK. It just means, you still have human nature. You still have idiots in charge. Mark Capellas is just another idiot. Doesn't have anything to do with the blockchain or Bitcoin whatsoever.
Well, in fact, you also have it with gold and silver. There have been many frauds involving gold and silver over the past 5,000 years. Because humans are always part of the equation. Wherever there's money, there's a transaction happening usually between two human beings. And likely one of them is going to try to defraud you or get a better price than they should. But the other thing that you mentioned the fact that Citigroup gets bailed out. And of course, Citigroup is one of the banks that has been bailed out more often than any of the other banks, going back to all of the defaults of the 70s and 80s of sovereign debt around the world. And the IMF came in basically and shifted debts onto the local populations that should have been, blown up on Citigroup's books. But when they get bailed out, it reminded me also of a lot of people online who really don't actually know that much, but they'll say, every coin is a scam coin. They're all pre-mined. They say that they're pre-mined coins exist and the people who created a coin make some money. But in the case of the real financial system that we have around us, the current system, they essentially have pre-mined coins because when the Fed prints money for Citigroup or when the Citigroup goes to the Fed's discount window and borrows money from them, they're getting it at 0%, lending it out at a little bit more, maybe 2% to the government or 10, 15, 20% to some schmuck.
Yeah, the Doge, with the alt currency, the cryptocurrency, the meme-based currency with billions and hundreds of billions in the float and pre-mined as it has more integrity than the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States or any central bank. They are engaged in pre-mining, but as you point out, they pre-mine the coins and give it to warmongering. They give it to Tony Blair to go start a war, or to give somebody else, some country to start a war, the military defense contractors to start a war. They'll give it to a bank to commit financial fraud. They'll give it to a Mexican drug cartel to launder billions in drug profits. At least with Doge, they're giving it to nerds and geeks and crypto traders and good causes. They have a lot of good causes they're giving the money to. The other cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin itself is not pre-mined. No, it's mined and it's scarce and it's desirable like gold, like silver.
Now, the other thing that you can compare the Citigroup story and the Federal Reserve banking system to Mt. Gox is this notion that Karpeles of Mt. Gox claimed that all the 744,000 Bitcoin had leaked from cold storage. And in order to constantly paper over the fraud in the current banking system, basically our wealth has leaked over the past 40 years since we've been off a gold standard. And you could look at it when the banking system collapsed and when they no longer had the ability for briefly to print money and cover up everything. When all the frauds were exposed, what happened? People looked around and realized, wait, all I have is debt and no job, no real wealth creating job, no real income. And they suddenly realized that all their real wealth had been leaked over the past 40 years from cold storage.
Well, Mark Capellas' biggest mistake was that he didn't go directly to work for JP Morgan or HSBC, where his kind of lying and fraud would make him a lot of money and huge bonuses. I mean, he's trying to describe what's happening in Bitcoin by reading the pages of the Financial Times and using the same terminology that other bankers use to get off scot-free and get huge bonuses. But we're talking about the Bitcoin world, so it doesn't work. Now he's in big trouble. But if had he never touched a Bitcoin and simply gone into the proprietary trading desk of HSBC or Lloyd's Bank or Royal Bank of Scotland, he would be either running the bank or retired with a fat pension or getting a huge bonus right now. That was his mistake, to get involved in Bitcoin in the first place. He has the mind, he has a criminal mind of a banker in the city of London. He should be at Royal Bank of Scotland, not Bitcoin.
Well, actually, when he did a press conference and he came out and he bowed very deeply, this was in Japan, and then spoke Japanese, I thought the next thing, as soon as he bowed, was he's going to take out a sword and commit seppuku, but he didn't. And yet, so I want to also continue on this one more time and then bring it back to the Ukraine and all the other stuff that's happening in Europe. And the world's been Mt. Gox. So here you had Karpeles blaming the 744,000 Bitcoin, which are worth $423 million in the market, i.e. exactly what Citigroup lost in their transaction malleability fraud. And people are shrieking. But this is what they say. Let's step back for a moment from all the reactionary hype and gain some perspective. The Mt. Gox implosion sounds very familiar. In March 2013, a crisis of forced austerity hit the small Mediterranean island of Cyprus when the government closed the country's second largest bank in return for an international bailout by Eurogroup. People rushed to protect their savings, but the bank had already raided their accounts, outright stealing the citizens' money. The Cypriots got goxed. Not only did the Cypriots get goxed, she says, but in the U.S., the 2008 financial crisis and bailout of Wall Street banks that followed was basically a theft of close to $1 trillion from the U.S. taxpayers. The Americans got goxed. This was papered over with more debt and money printing.
So true. Going forward, Bitcoin will make a new all-time high, probably in this year, 2014. And so will gold, and so will silver. So the world is awash in fiat nonsense. It's killing and drowning the world in worthless, no collateral backed paper tomfoolery.
Well, also in the Ukraine, you see them getting goxed because there are credit controls, capital controls. They're unable to withdraw. Some banks only are allowing $100 worth a day to be withdrawn.
Those people should have Bitcoin.
But also, yeah, you know, those can go up and down, but we're talking about your wealth being leaked from cold storage. Beyond any of the speculative bets that might happen, here we have a situation where we have Citigroup on one hand lost $400 million. On the other hand, Mt. Gox lost $400 million. What's the response, Max? Citigroup will be bailed out. Mt. Gox, what happened to them? They failed, right? They're bankrupt. They've declared bankruptcy. They've gone out of business. Therefore, that community is going to be stronger because there's no moral hazard. It doesn't get spread out over 40 years.
It's evolution, isn't it? It's evolution as applied to economics. It's survival of the fittest, and Mt. Gox didn't work out. Some other exchange will take its place. This is supposed to be what free markets are about. It's supposed to be a meritocracy. It's supposed to be an evolution. It's supposed to be rewarding good actors and penalizing bad actors. You're not supposed to reward the bad actors and penalize the good actors. Look in the UK economy, for example. The small and medium-sized enterprises are being ripped off by Royal Bank of Scotland, who gets all the money they want from the Bank of England. That's reverse evolution. That's why the economy is devolving in places like the UK, and the Bitcoin economy is evolving, and at one point they're going to cross each other's paths like ships in the night, and we'll say goodbye to fiat forever. Hello, crypto. Stacey, we got to go. Thank you.
All right, Max.
Stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more. Welcome back to the Kaiser Report. I'm Max Kaiser. Time now to turn to Bitcoin and cryptocurrency enthusiast Tour Demester, who was just in Cyprus for the launch of Neo-B. Tour, welcome to the Kaiser Report. Again, welcome back.
Hi, Max. Nice to be here.
All right, so you just came back from Cyprus, Neo-B. Tell us about it.
Well, Cyprus is really interesting. Cyprus, to me, illustrates how desperation is a powerful catalyst for disruption. That's what we're seeing in Cyprus. There's desperation, of course, with the bail-ins of last year. Lots of people lost millions of dollars. The economy's in tatters. And now there's this Bitcoin startup that's making waves. There's billboards all over the island. There was a huge media campaign. Everybody's talking about this Neo thing. If you walk around with a T-shirt, people will, talk to you and ask, so explain to me, what is this about? So they create a lot of buzz. And of course, they got a promise that they still need to fulfill. But I think it's a very impressive example of how it's possible to bring Bitcoin to the mainstream. That's really what I see happening there.
People talk about we need a Bitcoin Shangri-La. We need a place, a country that will, instead of fighting Bitcoin, embrace it for what it is. It's a fantastic, cheap way to send money. It's a store of value, and it's a growth industry in itself. It creates jobs. Obviously, New York and San Francisco or anywhere in the United States are going to resist it because you've got an entrenched oligopoly. They're going to resist it in Europe. But in place like Cyprus, is Cyprus going to be the country that says, you know what, we're going to be the Switzerland of crypto, or talk about it?
The way I see Bitcoin is sort of like a benign virus. It's going to where the resistance is least. And there's several places where the cloud could hit the earth, and it could be Cyprus. We can also think about countries like Panama, like Hong Kong, Switzerland. I mean, time will tell, but what's for sure, I think it's going to be small countries that are nimble, that offer a lot of freedom, economic freedom, and maybe have a background already in technology. So I think Cyprus also has the combination with the desperation. So it's kind of like a real good fit. Looks something like a battleship in the Mediterranean with cannons aimed at Europe. Who knows? I mean, the next step could be the pigs countries.
That's an interesting phrase you used there. The cloud could hit the earth. So is that an idiomatic phrase, or is it? Are you talking about the Bitcoin cloud? The cloud, in the cloud. It means a beautiful phrase. Expand on that a little bit.
I mean, Bitcoin is money in the cloud, right? It's money and financial services, all of it in the cloud. No counterparty risk, those kind of things. But of course, at some point, real life entrepreneurs with physical shops and all that, they want to interact with it. And then what you want is a hub, is companies that make that transition possible, that give them access to the cloud. And that's what's gradually happening. It's going from geek territory into the real world economy.
Now, in places like Africa, it's almost as if the cryptocurrency and the digital currency world is seceding from the fiat world. People are living and breathing and working totally in crypto. So that very sensitive membrane between crypto and fiat at the exchanges, and that's where the folks who are trying to get at crypto are attacking those exchanges, Mt. Gox being an example. But before talking about Mt. Gox, comment on this idea that in places like Africa, people are going to be born and die completely in crypto.
Yeah, that's why we talk about a paradigm shift, right? You'll be able to live in the crypto paradigm if you want to, and increasingly, and that's the interesting thing about Cyprus. I mean, there were 2 conferences back to back, and they reached 400 top executives, people from Coca-Cola, Deloitte, the banks were all there. And now they're approaching this Bitcoin startup because they want to interact with it. They want to be part of the network because they're realizing they can really reach this cloud audience, the Bitcoin audience, and get drum up some more business in Cyprus in combination with lower transaction fees and all the other advantages.
Right. Let's talk about what it means to be born in the crypto cloud. What do you get if you're born into this crypto cloud? You get, I would say off the top of my head, just to get this ball rolling here, you get a real currency with a store of value that's a limited supply, that's similar to gold. You get transactions that are near zero in terms of cost. You get, how would you expand on that?
Well, you might also get accounting that's very airtight, where not necessarily everybody could see everything that goes on inside, but where you can prove mathematically that there is no fraud in the system, which is amazing for emerging economies. We can have, think about all the startup city projects that are out there that are thinking about a city in a box. Well, what if there's a country that wants to bootstrap an economy? They can use those concepts and add crypto to it and really create something quite amazing, like an instant Hong Kong kind of situation. You bring in the knowledge from outside, and you just and that's how you create a lot of international tax competition and those kind of things.
Yeah, a lot of times people talk about Bitcoin as a way to fulfill, let's say, a libertarian agenda of smaller governments or no governments, and even people who would be for government, let's say, and are supporters of government, you can't deny the fact that if you on the blockchain, if you have this open ledger system, and all of your government functions are going to be extremely efficient, and the cost would drop dramatically. So it's not really about, you could be for or against government, but nobody is going to be for bloated government. It
Right.
doesn't make sense to spend more for government services than is absolutely the minimum that you want to spend to get your essential government services. So if you go into a crypto, if you're born into the crypto cloud, you can have all the government you want as long as it's completely efficient. Mm-hmm. The problem is bloated government and non-accountability. That's where you end up with the problems.
I think the big word now, especially after Mt. Gox, is proof of reserves and accountability with a capital letter A. Well, we got this technology where you can do bottom-up auditing of reserves, and I think that's gonna, a lot of consumers are gonna demand that more and more, and we're gonna see businesses that set the example of how to do it.
Well, you mentioned reserves for a moment there. Let's talk about reserves, because in a bank system we have now, which is a fractional reserve banking system, and according to Basel III Accord, banks are only required to have 3% of deposits on reserve in case of an emergency. And we know that they game the system by fudging their collateral values and by claiming that they own government bonds when they don't, and they lend things out that they don't really own. And so these banks are technically insolvent. HSBC, Societe Generale, BNP, Citibank, Bank of America, technically they're insolvent. They have no reserves at all. They have negative reserves. But if you're talking about a Bitcoin-based banking system, the blockchain itself is 100% backed by itself. It's 100% reserve banking in a way, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, you can have businesses on top of that, like Mt. Gox, who actually probably for the most part of its lifetime had higher reserves than most of the banks in this city and around the world. But eventually, reality hits and there's some kind of bank run situation, and then truth comes out. So,
but just to be clear, so
Mt.
Gox is or was an exchange, and it's run by somebody who's like a John Corzine or someone on Wall Street or the City of London who's not either competent or corrupt, either of those two things. And it doesn't affect the blockchain at all. The integrity of the value per Bitcoin is completely untouched by the Mt. Gox scandal. It would be like saying if the COMEX blew up in New York, the value of gold might go up or down for a few days, but it ultimately has nothing to do with the value of gold, whether or not the COMEX exists or not.
We have so much history to prove that. 19th century, the period of wildcat banking, and people were saying like, oh, it was irresponsible and some banks blew up, but it didn't change the value of gold. And the economy never grew faster than in that period of time. And the same is true for Bitcoin. I don't see Bitcoin being affected by this. I think it's more like a cleansing situation and a wake-up call for a lot of people.
All right, let's get back to the macro geopolitical system again, because I think this is really interesting, because you're a kind of a world traveler, you're going to all these countries, and the history of the world is the history of banks as reserve currency, because right now America is a world reserve currency. Before then it was the British pound. And going back a few hundred years, you had the France was the world reserve, Spanish was world reserve, Portugal had the world reserve, and every 100 years or so, there's a change. The U.S. economy is clearly bankrupt on many levels. They are really like Rome in the last days, where they can't defend or support their empire anymore. There will be a new reserve currency. Some people say it could be China, but China says we don't want to be the world reserve currency. Some people say the IMF will come up with the special drawing right as the world reserve currency. Why not have that world reserve currency possibly be Bitcoin?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no reason for it not to be. And the way I see it is, Bitcoin is a technology that can break a monopoly, similar to how in the late Middle Ages, people were kind of sick and tired. The city-states were sick and tired of the monopoly of Rome, the Roman Church around the world, in Europe, And so what they did is they used the technology of the printing press to allow for more interpretations and religiosity, and that eventually broke the monopoly. And the cool thing about Bitcoin is that because conversion to Bitcoin immediately means a gigantic transfer of wealth. So we can have an instant transition towards a new paradigm, and that means we can skip decades of witch burning and wars and all that. I think that's a wonderful prospect.
Another interesting historical observation is that typically centuries don't define themselves until they get around to the year 13 or 14. We had World War I happened in 1914, for example, and then going back to 1814 and 1714 and 1614, there's usually events that define that century. Could potentially, are we in a window right now where we're going to see in the next 12 months this paradigm shift and Bitcoin be the defining element of this century?
I don't know if it's going to be the next 12 months, but it makes sense to say that, yeah, the early 2000s was the internet, then the layer of Bitcoin came on top, and I think, yeah, we got a pretty powerful shot at a huge paradigm shift. All this financial history we've seen for so long, and there's never been a change like this with, like you say, the blockchain, a full reserve system, full accountability, and choice in currency.
Right. So the university in Cyprus is extremely supportive of the whole Bitcoin initiative. And going back historically on the academic front, back to Aristotle, back to Newton, talking about who was first Bank of England governor, I believe, always came back to their definition of money being gold. And they cite four basic characteristics: fungibility, portability, desirability, and scarcity. So Bitcoin fulfills all four of those elements. The one people have questions about is scarcity. Is it scarce? They don't understand how digits and numbers can be scarce. Explain that a little bit.
Yeah, it is absolutely scarce because the value of Bitcoin is in the network. You can go to another altcoin, but the network of the other altcoin is very different, much smaller usually. And so there are only ever going to be 21 million coins to allow you to drive on this amazing network.
We got to go. We're out of time, but thanks so much for being back on the Kaiser Report.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Kaiser Report with me, Max Kaiser, and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Tor De Meister. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Kaiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.